Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, we're talking about the new album from Jean-Michel Jarre, Equinoxe Infinity. Okay, Jean-Michel Jarre, there is literally no point in me actually introducing this guy right now. I think we should all know him well, and if not, I just got done finishing a series breaking down my thoughts on his entire discography about 2 months ago. You can feel free to click the link in the description and hear me talk about him more there. If you really want an brief segment, watch the Oxygen 3 video. But yeah, synth pioneer legend, made so many albums I love, and one of the most name-dropped artists on the channel. We all know him well already. May as well just get right into my expectations going into this latest album. And I'm gonna have to admit, right out the gate, I wasn't really going nuts with excitement over this particular project. It just kinda caught me off guard, like, whoa, another one already? I mean, Jarre has been delivering no shortage of quality material in this decade. For instance, his last studio album, Oxygen 3, in my opinion is one of his best albums to date. The way it builds upon his legacy of his original classic, Oxygen, and in a way that was very different to the previous sequel he did, Oxygen 713, but still very compelling. I love the crap out of it, but seeing a sequel to his second main album, Equinoxe, took me aback a bit. I mean, the pressure to live up to Equinoxe is not going to be even close to as intense as a sequel to Oxygen would be, because think about Equinoxe, that was basically just a sequel to Oxygen already. Now don't get me wrong, I love Equinoxe, and I think it's a fantastic album with lots of Jarre's most iconic tracks. I just don't think it was a revolutionary one. Sonically, it didn't change the game in the same way Oxygen did, because it basically did all the exact same things. I suppose it helped contribute to the sounds that would form the techno and trance genres later on, but it didn't invent them. For instance, Giorgio had already made I Feel Love at this point. If Jarre were making, I don't know, Zuluk Infinity or Metamorphoses Infinity, that'd be different because those albums are so much more distinct and stick out as unique entrants in his back catalog. Equinoxe doesn't really have that history-changing legacy to build off that Oxygen does. It's always going to be living in Oxygen's shadow. I didn't actually listen to any of the pre-album singles since I didn't want any spoilers, but I imagined this was basically just going to be an album of Jarre being Jarre without any real interesting gimmicks or twists. Which, you know, I'm still excited to hear because I still love Jarre's style, just not expecting to be blown away by it. I did think it was interesting how this album, despite being made out of 10 numbered pieces, all the individual parts had proper names. Which is not something he's done before. It's always either just named tracks or just numbered parts of the same whole. This is the first one to be both, so that's cool. But yeah, that's all the intro I have. What did we get with Equinoxe Infinity? Alright, so in some ways I kinda got what I expected, in other ways I didn't. By the way, can you switch over the other version of the album cover that looks better? Nice. Okay. For one thing, this album does directly call back to Equinoxe a lot more than I thought it would. And maybe a little bit of chronology as well while I'm at it. There's a lot of elements here that remind me of that album. Now I suppose it's an expansion on the original Equinoxe like Oxygen 3 was to the original Oxygen, but I think it has less ground to stand on in terms of being its own thing. What I liked most about Oxygen 3 was how it could repurpose the ideas that the original brought to the table, but still set itself apart as its own solid Jarre album in its own right. But Equinoxe Infinity seems more like a direct rehash to me. A heavily modernized rehash with all the most up-to-date sounds like Oxygen 3 delivered, yet still not in a way that sounded dated, but a rehash all the same. Nearly everything in this album feels like stuff Jarre's already done before. That's not to say this was a bad album by any stretch. I still enjoyed it quite a lot. I think the modernized updates sound really great, and I think it's pretty solid across the board. But as someone who enjoys Jarre the most when he's pushing the envelope, I don't think this delivered him in top form. Now there is one really irritating thing I have to get out of the way with this album real quick, and that regards its continuous mix. It was very clearly put together with a mix in mind. You can hear transitions and well-executed segues between tracks, but if you're listening to this on Spotify, you still get fade-outs at the end of every movement. Said fade-outs are extremely forced and unnecessary. I have no idea what Jarre was thinking with this move, especially since Oxygen 3 just mixed the tracks together normally. Who the hell actually wanted fade-outs between tracks? If you include those, my rating of this album goes down almost a full point, because that is just really annoying. But I know a proper continuous mix of this album actually does exist. I have heard it and replaced the standard version with it, so this criticism can be ignored if you just have the regular continuous mix. So anyway, let's talk about the actual content of this album. So yeah, there are tracks here which just directly take elements from previous Jarre albums. Movement 1, The Watchers, I'm pretty sure directly samples Equinoxe Part 1. Movement 3, Robots Don't Cry, has the exact same percussion patterns as Oxygen 2 and 4. He's done that a couple of times. Movement 5, If the Wind Could Speak, is a pretty obvious homage to the Band in the Rain section of Equinoxe Part 8. Movement 7, Machines Are Learning, is basically a dark transitional moment between two more melodic parts, very much in the same way Equinoxe Part 6 bridged the gap between parts 5 and 7, and made kind of a mini-suite there. Albeit this particular iteration not being as memorable. A lot of that kind of thing. Oh, and Movement 6, Infinity, uses the 4 chords of pop. Just ended up making me think, really, dude? Is that the best you could come up with in 2018? And another little reference that I actually kind of did like more, and well, I'm not entirely sure if it was intentional. The final movement and title track here does have a synth progression running through a big chunk of it that reminded me a lot of the Orb's huge, ever-growing, pulsating brain. I was half waiting for Minnie Riperton to show up out of nowhere and start singing, "Loving you is all I wanna do." I mean, the Orb were featured on Jarre's Electronica 2 project. I seriously doubt Jarre has not heard the Orb's track, so it might not be a coincidence, but I don't actually know. Be a cool reference to, if a bit bizarre one to be making in 2018. But okay, this album isn't just a front-to-back parade of nostalgia pandering and references. There were some moments on here that are actually really solid out-of-context Jarre tracks. Just him doing what he does best. Movement 2, Flying Totems, pretty typical single in his usual style. A bit like Magnetic Fields Part 1, maybe. But I really love the chord progressions on that one, really dramatic and epic stuff. And Movement 8, the opening, is in fact his Coachella opening, with a proper title, and I like it a lot more hearing it in the context of this album and how it fits into the surrounding tracks. That main melody's starting to become really memorable. Heck, there are moments I already mentioned above that have really cool ideas in spite of sharing time with obvious callbacks. Robots Don't Cry has a lot of these cool Mellotron sounds in it that I don't think I've really heard from him yet. If the Wind Could Speak has a lot of these quirky vocal snippets, and The Watchers does still pretty consistently wow me with its huge bombasticness. Almost sounds orchestral a bit, which you know Jarre's done that before too, but still awesome to hear. For other moments I haven't mentioned yet, there's also Part 4, All That You Leave Behind, which has the feel of a slow burner from Rendezvous, sort of. It is one moment that is a bit more of its own thing, kind of has a bit more of a modern flavor that's still Jarre, I guess. And Part 9, Don't Look Back, is one I gotta specifically highlight. It's one of the catchiest and most memorable moments on this album, with its stately violin sounds as accompaniment. That little element goes a long way. It's just a shame that these violins sound kinda strange. It sounds like a really tiny fraction of a second is muted in the middle of each violin note, and the final effect is that it sounds a bit like a low-quality MP3. So I'm not sure what's up with that. But yes, the track itself is well good enough to make up for that weird gripe. So I guess those are my thoughts on this thing from an individual track basis. As for final thoughts, I suppose it is interesting to compare this album to his last one, Oxygen 3, and I know there's going to be people who will prefer this album over that one. I can definitely see the case being made for this being the stronger album, given how the textures here are a lot more well-defined and distinctive, the tracks have a lot more identity from each other, and sound like no one else besides Jarre could have been able to do it. I can also see people loving this album for the same reasons I love Oxygen 713, like how it updates the original. From a textural standpoint, this album certainly has much more going on than 03, and the experience is a lot more, I don't know, exciting? If I listened to O3 right after hearing this album, I'll admit this had a lot more emotional variety and kept me more on my seat, focusing more on that big, epic side of Jarre. But I'm still personally going to have to make the case that O3 was the better album, because I really love that album's more subtle approach. It was way more rewarding with repeat visits because I had to really mull it over and think about it for me to figure out what Jarre was trying to do with that one and for it to really click with me. And once it did, it was just all of the yes. Equinoxe Infinity, I basically got everything there was to get with one listen, and my subsequent 6 or 7 listens since haven't risen or lowered my opinion on the experience any, or revealed much of anything that I didn't already notice before. The parallels to the first Equinoxe were pretty thuddingly on the nose in many parts, especially movements 5 through 8. The album Equinoxe Infinity reminds me the most of is honestly probably Chronology, primarily in the way it so plainly rehashes old ideas Jarre had already done before, and this did it a lot more blatantly than Chronology did. The nostalgia pandering here is pretty dang shameless. That said, I still think this is a better album than Chronology. First of all, since there's no embarrassing moments on here, really. At least when Jarre used the 4 chords of pop here, it was in a minor key and not in a major key like on Chronology 4, which was just kinda cheesy. And at least there's no super dated and lame jock jam noises. But the one thing that above all saves Equinoxe Infinity has to be its production, which is consistently absolutely incredible, with really only the violins in Part 9 that I kinda gave the side eye. And even there, the composition there was enough of a highlight to make up for that weird little gripe. This album sounds amazing. I love the way it sounds. I also really like the way it's structured as well, and its pacing and everything. It's still a very solid album, and it's definitely recommended. That said, I also wonder if maybe people who haven't heard any Jarre before might be able to get more out of it. Not getting the obvious throwbacks might allow people to just enjoy the production for what it is, and, that's very well done. But yeah, for me, this is mid-lower tier Jarre. It's not one that fully exemplifies the things I personally love about him the most, but, it's still a very solid Jarre album. I'm feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it, though if you include those annoying fadeouts, it's 6.5, but I can ignore that. 7.3. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.